Hello, everyone, and welcome to Stage 501. Tonight, I'm your host and MC, Rei Murasame. We only have one guest today, and hey, this time around, I'm actually following the cue cards, so we should have a much more efficient stream than usual. More detailed profile information is going to be displayed on screen now, so let's move forward with the introductions, and I'll guess myself first. So, as you know, I approach politics from the perspective of the socialist third worldism tendency, and I'm an advocate of post colonial feminism. Um, I guess what I'll do next is I'll just pass it over to Captain Swiss. So give us your introduction as well.
Well, hi Ray, thanks very much for having me. I'm Captain Swiss, for any of your audience who might not know me already. I describe myself as a social democrat, probably sitting somewhere on the soft left or the centre left of British politics. That's probably the best summary I can offer, to be honest.
Sounds pretty good to me. So, let's just jump right in, because I've been watching your YouTube channel quite a lot since the COVID-19 crisis started, and I saw you had this long series called, what was it, a COVID-19 bunker stream, right? And you were in this bunker. And you managed to avoid the corona for a long time. So tell me what that was all about, how it went, and then how it ended up. Because at the end of all this, I guess I'm giving the listeners a spoiler on this one, but at the end of all this, you somehow acquired immunity to COVID-19. So explain how all that went.
Right. Well, first of all, I ought to say the name of the series, Corona Bunker. It was meant to sort of just act as a similar to how most other people are going through this, really, that, being in our own lockdowns or various forms of isolation or what have you, it does feel like a sort of bunker mentality, especially if you happen to be an individual who's living alone. Now, in regards to me gaining immunity to the thing, I probably ought to be quite clear. During the period I was making these videos, I did get ill for a little while. The way I describe it, it was flu-like. Maybe in the way that coronavirus is described as flu-like, and it was a bit nasty for the better part of a week, but I got over it. So I've speculated it could have been coronavirus, but obviously without having had a test to confirm or deny that, I'm not 100% sure.
Right. So you're still actually engaging in the usual precautions and trying to avoid being hit by the corona, basically, because of the fact that you don't know whether what you had at the time was actually corona or some kind of flu.
That's right, yeah. So I'd say since having been ill a month and a half ago, personally, I probably feel a little bit less concerned about myself and the coronavirus, as I say, because I think there's the possibility I may have had it. But, I'm still trying to do the sensible thing, maintaining distance from people, washing your hands, all those sort of necessary precautions.
So I was also looking at your Twitter account as well, and am I correct in understanding that you might soon be in a situation where you have to continue to go outside repeatedly in order to do your work?
Yes, that's right. I'm currently between jobs at the moment. There's a much larger, longer story I could tell you, but I'll leave that aside for the time being. I'll just say for now I'm searching for work.
Okay.
But I've got a job interview next week, and if I do end up getting it, I'll be returning to social care, which was something that I'd been doing previously. And yes, if I do end up going into that field, then that will involve leaving the house 4 or 5 times a week, going off to a care home and working. And I mean, judging from what we've heard about the epidemic within the UK, arguably walking into the belly of the beast as far as where all the coronavirus might be at.
Yeah, it sounds extremely dangerous. Now, obviously, I respect deeply the work that you do, because not a lot of people are appreciative of just how much key workers have been vital to getting through this crisis. I mean, goodness knows that the Tory government has not been exceptionally good at recognizing this beyond the performative clapping that we've seen going on all over the place. So, I mean, maybe what I'm saying to you right now is probably not that much better than clapping, but I mean, think of it this way: if we had a Labour government in, we'd be able to do substantively more than clapping, I think. Although that brings us to the next topic already, which is what do you think of Keir Starmer's leadership? Because I saw that in your introduction card, you're saying that you're a former Labour supporter. So explain to I guess the audience why it is that you've passed into being a former Labour supporter, and furthermore, why you ran as an independent instead of joining the Labour Party and attempted to run as one of their MPs. What was your motivation here? And I'm not saying it in an
Right.
antagonistic way, obviously, purely out of
No,
curiosity.
no, of course. Well, I'll answer those things chronologically, if you don't mind. We'll get to Starmer afterwards, just because it makes more sense to explain where I got to before Starmer came along. So I had been a registered Labour supporter. I joined the party at the time that Jeremy Corbyn first became leader, having signed up and voted for him in the leadership election, and then the subsequent one that came the year after as well. Um, where where I eventually sort of parted ways with the Labour fold, I think, was down to two issues mainly. Obviously, one of the big issues for me, being a Eurosceptic, was initially it seemed to me that Labour was going to follow along the route of, okay, you've had this referendum on the EU, you voted to leave, we accept that, we're going to pursue some form of Brexit,
Hmm.
even if their pitch for Brexit may have been a somewhat softer one than I would have preferred, I still would have gone, well, they're still following from that direction from the public, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But it was where the party's policy began to start getting very much steered towards this discussion of a second referendum, and clearly within the party there are elements that arguably would have liked to have stopped Brexit altogether. I think a tipping point came for me maybe where it seemed quite clear that Corbyn was buckling to that demand and basically flipping what the Labour position was, from saying no to a second referendum to ultimately endorsing one. Oh, and the second thing, mind you, would just be I think earlier in Corbyn's leadership, I had a lot more optimism for the prospects of a Corbyn-led Labour Party getting into government. Certainly, I think
Yeah.
2017 they came quite close, but I think as time wore on, it became increasingly apparent to me that he just gelled so poorly with the larger British public that it wasn't really going to be a goer anymore.
There was also a story I saw earlier today. I might be able to bring it up in browser at some point as well. But I saw a story in which it was exposed that Keir Starmer was actually not obeying Jeremy Corbyn's positions on what the Europe position should have been, and he was effectively operating his own little hobbyist position from inside the party, which had a negative effect on the way that voters felt about the party. Do you agree that that was what was happening?
I may not have read specifically what you had today, but certainly hearing it described in those terms comes as no surprise. Like I had seen it over the course of a longer amount of time. It very much seemed that figures such as Keir Starmer and other fairly senior figures within Labour were sort of doing their best to pull the party off in a much more pro-EU direction, if we'll say, or an anti-Brexit direction in that sense. And
Yeah.
that did become increasingly apparent as time went on.
And do you believe that that was one of the things that very strongly harmed Labour's electoral prospects, particularly in the north?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
I'd say I wouldn't want to say that it was obviously the only factor in that election. I think it was arguably a bit of a perfect storm of a few things coming together. But certainly, such as the seat that I ran in, Stoke-on-Trent North, that was what was known as a former Labour heartland. So a place that Labour had historically done very well. Sort of high proportion of working class people living there. Formerly a very industrialised area, but
Yeah.
somewhat deindustrialised in the decades since the 80s or so. And they'd voted around 70% to leave, a 70-30 split to leave the EU. So that is probably a very good example of an area that gelled incredibly badly with what Labour's positioning on Brexit ultimately came to be.
Yeah, absolutely amazing. So this of course would then come back to like why you chose to run as an independent. You chose to run as an independent because you wanted to stake out the Eurosceptic position in Stoke North, wasn't it?
Yes, I'd long said to myself, if I ever arrived at an election and I really wasn't sure who I wanted to vote for, I wouldn't back someone in a half-hearted sense. I'd either spoil my ballot or choose to run myself.
Hmm.
And obviously, we know which one I ended up choosing in the end. But
Yeah.
it was genuinely sort of a sense of, I'm really not happy with any of the options here. At least if I put myself forwards, I know that I can well, at the very least, anyone who stands for election, they can stand on a platform they know at least they agree with 100%. So that's something, isn't it?
Yes, and there were a lot of people who were saying that there was like a left Brexit position that was entirely missing from the election because of the way that Labour chose to configure its approach. They had a very complex way of approaching it, where the Labour Party was saying that they wanted to have a second referendum in which the decision would be made between rejecting the deal or it's one of those things where I can't even remember it now. It was either to accept the deal that had been already negotiated, or to reject that deal and negotiate another. Was that what it was?
Oh, I'm trying to right. I think I've got a grasp on it because you're right. It is a tad long-winded. What they ultimately ended up proposing was to say to the British public, vote Labour and get us into power. Then we
Yeah.
will negotiate a new deal with the EU, one that's different
Oh yes, I
from the
remember
one that
now.
the
And then they can
Tories.
either vote for that deal or vote to remain.
That's right, yeah. But with the Labour leadership, obviously being Jeremy Corbyn at the time, saying, "And I'm not going to pick a side. I'm going to be an honest broker. I'm not going to take a view." Which some people out there believe rather sort of passionately. Oh, very very sensible, very adult, very grown up, trying to. Oh, terribly sorry. That's a different device vibrating. Trying to set himself above the fray. But quite honestly, my view on the thing was I thought it seemed like incredibly weak leadership not to be airing a view on what was at the time the most important issue the country was going through.
Yeah. Because at the time, it's one of those things where it played very well amongst I guess you could say, the kind of wonkish people who like to populate Twitter, including myself, right? However, outside of that bubble of people who were like, yeah, we kind of understand where he's going with this plan. It's an amazing piece of triangulation. Outside of that bubble, however, like I think most people were really put off by it, and the Conservatives were having a field day just criticizing it constantly and pointing out how it's almost like they described it as him being in neutral.
Yes, and I'd absolutely agree there. I think it took me a few years actually throughout the Corbyn leadership to really get a feel for the difference between what you'd witness on social media and what the state of play out there in the country was. And
Yeah.
certainly platforms like Twitter had a much stronger disposition to have sort of very vocal supporters of the Labour Party and therefore giving positive views on what their stances were as well. But fundamentally, that was kind of the situation. On Twitter, you'd get hashtags trending every week talking about Labour youth earthquakes of voters and resign Boris and all this, that, and the other. But ultimately, as things panned out, come election day, it was kind of shown that Twitter can represent public opinion to a certain degree, but it's certainly it's
It
certainly
has its
very heavily
limitations.
leans towards the left. Yeah, so it's not an awfully good barometer of public opinion. Not in all ways.
Hmm. Okay, so I mean, we're covering these relatively quickly, so yeah, I don't want to kind of like I should have actually changed the topic title as well. So we're in actually Labour Party right now, right? So um, I'm running out of questions on Labour, but don't worry about this. I will come up with more.
Um,
So
I haven't got round to Keir Starmer yet. We can come back to him if you like.
good point. Yeah, that's the thing. Yes, because for some reason I've checked that off, even though we haven't actually completed it. So yes, Keir Starmer. Now that he is the leader, like, what do you think of his leadership so far? Like, what is he doing right? What is he doing wrong? Do you think that he's a little he's a little too unassertive in the way that he presents things? Do you think that this lawyerly thing that he's doing at question time is going to backfire eventually, and it's going to make him look bland instead of quote forensic, as everyone keeps calling it?
Okay, well, first of all, I'm going to put aside for a moment the fact that I am a fairly ardent Leaver and he was the architect of Labour's second referendum policy.
Yeah.
Because if I'm factoring that in the whole time, I'm just going to end up very biased. But aside from that, what do I make of him? I think presentationally, at least, he certainly fits the mould a little bit more than Corbyn did of what I think most people out there expect a politician to look and sound like.
Mhm.
Which is a double-edged sword in its own way, because you've got, on the one hand, you've got people crying out for, we want genuine people, we don't want polished people, we don't want them airbrushed, but then at the same time, quite often they do end up going back to saying, well, actually we want a very slick, well-dressed person with lots of nice sound bites to tell us what's what. So there's a strange bit of duality on that one. As far as how he's done thus far, at first, I thought to myself, okay, it seems like he's making a very conscious effort to not be seen to be scoring political points during this coronavirus crisis, because obviously he's an untested leader who's only just came in right in the midst of all of this. So at first I thought, okay, then that's a different approach from what I may have expected from Corbyn, but let's see how it goes. Certainly, if you were to ask me, I don't know, time of national crisis, do you think the opposition should support the government where it's a good idea to support them and not gripe from the sidelines on every little thing that goes on? I'd agree with you on the face of it. I'd say, yeah, absolutely, that sounds reasonable. But the way that manifested itself, at least for the first few weeks, did come across as a bit soft. And increasingly as time went on, that's the way I felt about the thing. But then, just to throw a spanner in the works, literally within the last couple of days, we had the first Prime Minister's questions. So Keir Starmer, leader of the opposition, facing off against Boris Johnson, leader of the government. And actually, Starmer gave a better performance in that than he had done in recent weeks. So I'd say my view is that perhaps he had a bit of a soft approach at first, but perhaps he's listened to the critics and he's beginning to pose some of the slightly more challenging questions without constant caveats of, oh, but I support the government, do it in your own time. So I guess to use a law phrase, given it's Keir Starmer, the jury's out at the moment.
Yeah. Speaking of question time as well, I mean, the substance of the questions that were being asked in question time, and the fact that the COVID-19 pandemic is dragging on, particularly in the United Kingdom, which now has possibly among some of the worst performance on the issue in the entirety of Europe. Like, how do you feel about the length of time that it took for Boris Johnson's government to respond to the crisis, given that apparently, according to the Telegraph, British intelligence informed Number 10 of what the situation was in China in early January, and additionally informed them that China was not going to reveal to them the true extent of the damage because either they could not comprehend it yet, or because they didn't want to express it for whatever market-related reason they may have been unwilling to express it at the beginning, but that apparently Boris Johnson and the cabinet knew, but they didn't take action. And he
I
skipped
think
5 Cobra meetings.
Well, I think to give you a short answer, I do think that they were slow. I think that they were slow on the uptake of their response, not just bringing in the lockdown per se, but I think some of the advice that they were issuing in the run-up to the lockdown was sometimes a little bit muddled. We had a period of a day or so where we'd been advised not to go to pubs and restaurants, but yet they were still allowed to be open, which meant that the British public basically just did not follow that advice. They went, right, okay, but the pubs
Yeah.
are still open, right? Okay, we'll go then.
Yeah, I mean, did you see the story from I think it was in Yorkshire, and I hope I'm not getting it wrong. And then next thing you know, I have people from that location coming at me telling me that I've attributed this to them unfairly. But there was a story in which like police ended up busting into a pub, and they found that the people were actually violating the stay-at-home order and were hiding inside of closets when the police entered. Had you heard that one?
I think I have heard that one actually. So yes, we have had stories like that come along. We've seen both sides of it actually. During the length of this thing, we've seen occasions, I'd say, where the public have been quite, some members of the public have been quite irresponsible in flouting these rules, and I don't particularly qualm over. Say we're supposed to leave the house only once a day for either food or exercise or something, but if someone's gone to exercise in a park, personally, I'm not going to begrudge them sitting on a bench or
Yeah.
sitting down in the grass for half an hour if they really want.
Unless it's like hundreds of people all gathering in the same location at once, then it becomes slightly ridiculous.
Yeah, exactly. So sort of the better example I'd give would be, and we've had plenty of this as well, police having to break up house parties, people inviting 10, 20, 30 people into their homes. And you think
Yeah.
that goes so completely against what the purpose of this lockdown is supposed to be. But we have seen, we have seen both sides of it. We've seen at times members of the public being very stupid, but we've also seen police acting a bit. The phrase that's used in the
Ridiculously
media
as well.
repeatedly, overzealously. That's what it said.
Yeah. But no,
Yeah.
we've also seen law enforcement doing things that don't make any sense. I mean, you've seen the thing in London with the with the bridge, where they had all those first responders and police came to the bridge to clap, without realizing that if they all do that at the same time, that's not social distancing.
Yeah, yeah. And I think the other thing that I'd say, probably on a smaller scale example, is just the taping up of benches all around the place being, have police tape or some equivalent in order to prevent people from sitting on them. I sometimes wonder just visually whether that gives off the right idea exactly.
Yeah,
But
it looks
just
definitely looks weird.
yeah, especially as the tape itself manifestly doesn't actually do anything to stop anyone sitting on the bench. But
Yeah, I mean,
uh,
they can literally just go ahead and be like, just defy the tape.
to go back to your earlier question, just about the government's handling of the lockdown and the crisis and bringing things in, I'd say that they've done poorly. But I think that's a position that's taken me a little bit of time to arrive at. I think from the off, I was trying to be careful to say to myself, this is still an unprecedented situation. I'm obviously not naturally the biggest supporter of the Conservatives. I'm trying to give them room and to
Give
be
them a fair
fair to
shake,
them.
right?
Yeah, I was doing my best to do that, but I think
This is how it is with the Conservative Party. It seems that the more you try to give them a fair shake, the more they will actually rub it in your face and continue to do complete madness. This is how it's
oh,
been.
absolutely. I think the real slap in the face for me came when we had a target for the end of last month that they wanted to reach 100,000 people getting
100,000
tested.
tests. Yeah.
That's right. And they say that they passed it on that day and that they got 122,000. But if you drill down into the numbers, there's a bit of a point of contention. Is it really people who've been tested, or is it just tests that have been dispatched out to places? So there's that debate
Yeah.
to have.
It turns out that they were dispatching tests and counting them in the number of tests, even though they hadn't received them back.
That's right. So exactly like you said, it made it very difficult for me to try and give them that leeway, because I'd even said originally, the fact that they've increased the testing capacity, say if they don't even end up on 100,000 and they're only on 80,000 or something like that, okay, they've missed the target, but I'm still going to say I'm pleased that they've increased the capacity. They've obviously, got a move on and actually started moving in that direction. But it was the day of that target, whether or not it'd been met, and then the subsequent days where the numbers have fallen anyway. But all along, they've been giving it all this self-congratulation. Oh, we absolutely smashed the target. We proved all of the doubters wrong. You're just trying to cause trouble for us, etc. And it's just manifestly a bit of barefaced lying and deflection away from them not meeting their own numbers. And it's
Yes.
that kind of thing I really don't appreciate.
The personal protective equipment thing also contained the seeds of a lie as well. When they kept claiming they have brought in or distributed a certain number of individual pieces of protective equipment, right? And then it later emerged that they were like counting individual hand towels as PPE.
Gloves, I believe it was.
Yeah, and
Individual gloves from the
each
hands.
individual
Yeah.
glove was being counted separately as well.
That's it, yeah. And it's that kind of thing that makes it very hard for me to sit here and go, right, I'm trying to give you the time of day here, Conservative government. I recognise there's a crisis, and I'll be fair. Weeks ago, when the Chancellor Rishi Sunak was announcing these measures to try and prop up some businesses and to cover
Yeah.
wages and things along those lines,
They had a
they'll
lot of
always,
good faith back then when the
yeah,
public was
yeah.
very open to what they were doing.
Exactly. So at the very least, I could see from where I was, okay, it's not as if they're sitting on their hands here and doing nothing. I can tell that they are obviously, obviously dealing with coronavirus is basically their only job right now. It's the only thing they're spending their time on. But nonetheless, it's just when it comes along with a nice big helping of fudging the numbers to try and make yourself look better and batting away any kind of criticism as being, oh, that's just partisan and that sort of thing. That goodwill towards them ran out after about a month or so, I'd say, for me at least.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing about this, which is truly astounding as well, is I'm sure you've heard of exercise sickness, which was supposed to be like a series of tests for stress testing the system that they were supposed to carry out in order to find out like where they were on pandemic response. And apparently conservatives during the austerity years just didn't follow the advice that emerged out of exercise sickness. They just ignored it. So this then led to the weird and paradoxical situation where Singapore has fully copied the United Kingdom's pandemic response plan, and it has worked very well, but the United Kingdom has not followed the United Kingdom's pandemic response plan. It's almost unbelievable.
Yeah,
it's one of those things where the plan would have worked had conservatives actually followed it.
And just one thing to add to that, just in terms of the response to this, I've seen a comment in your live chat saying, but the Tories are at 50% in popularity, so obviously your grievances in particular aren't necessarily reflected. And maybe that's just an interesting thing to comment on as well. Just that we have seen, but both in this country and many countries around the world, the incumbent governments dealing with the coronavirus crisis, pretty much all of them without exception, from what I've noticed, enjoying a boost in approval and popularity and things along those lines.
Yeah, I mean, some people have posited the idea that you're just going to get a boost no matter what you do.
Yeah, I think there's probably a strong element of just, if the public at large has a sense of, okay, there's a crisis out there, there's a big problem that needs to be dealt with. If they can at least look to the government and see, are you doing anything about it? And if the government's able to stand there and do a press conference and say, well, we're bringing in this measure, that measure, this lockdown, these payments for workers or what have you, then on a very basic level of it, you get to look at it and you go, well, they're responding, they're doing something about it.
Yeah, people will think that it's better than literally nothing happening.
Yeah, exactly.
Which isn't always true, because I mean, sometimes doing a little bit more than nothing is still disastrous.
Well, I mean, that's it. There's a what would you call it? A gradient on this thing, isn't there?
Yeah.
Of how much you can do and how much it will affect things. But just one last observation on that as well.
Okay, go ahead.
I was just going to say, we've even noticed that on a sub-national level within the UK as well, that in Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, who rules the roost, she's seen a big boost to the popularity of the SNP. So even though Scotland has like a degree of devolved powers, but they're not quite their own country within the UK, if that makes sense. But nonetheless, I think because she is seen as the incumbent government within Scotland, again, she's seen that similar sort of popularity numbers increase for the SNP as the Tories have in England, I guess you'd say.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense as well. Yeah, so there's always that little bump that seems to happen with people viewing their government as doing something. I mean, I've noticed among right-wing commentators as well, I mean, particularly in social media, that there has been this weird flip that has occurred over time. At the beginning of the crisis, they were all praising South Korea as the model that you have to follow. And now that it has emerged that the Tory government is never going to get anywhere near to South Korean levels of response, now they're suddenly like, here are the drawbacks of the South Korean model. Right? They've essentially inverted their commentary in order to make sure that they don't end up having to criticize Boris Johnson. I mean, have you noticed this on your side?
I haven't. I'm not incredibly in tune to what the right is saying about the South Korea model. But in a more general sense, I can at least say I have noticed the tendency that you'll get. Obviously, the left is far more likely to be critical of the government's approach. The right is far more likely to defend it.
Search for ways to change the narrative around and make it not look quite as bad as it really is.
Yeah, although the other interesting thing is I have noticed there's obviously like a segment out there of what I describe as being the libertarian right, who
Yeah.
are critical of the government because they don't believe that a lockdown should have been imposed at
All
all,
right. So they're
or not
thinking
to the
it's not
degree it
even
was.
lax enough yet. They need to be fully horizontal in order for it to be acceptable. It's just like,
Yeah,
that's truly amazing. But yes, I have seen some of those comments as well. And often they're like the guys who have like the American flag in their bio alongside the British one for whatever reason. Because
the
obviously, I mean,
special
you've
relationship.
seen these things going on in the United States with like these attempts by people to sort of get out of the lockdowns and just defy their governors and so on. Like, what did you think of this stuff going on in the United States? Like, how should we respond to them in terms of I don't know how to phrase it in a way that doesn't sound terrible, but like, how do we respond to them in terms of in terms of travel, tourism, and immigration now with the United States if they don't engage in the correct amount of deterring the virus that they're supposed to be engaged in? Like, I've heard that Spain now is limiting tourism from the United States to itself because they don't want to import the virus back from the US. Do you think we should adopt something similar to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the very least, for the time being where we are, I'd like to see us in the position of where we're not really having anyone from anywhere else come here unless it's deemed, absolutely necessary, either
Yeah,
be it some kind of a coronavirus or government related job that needs doing, or bringing British people back from abroad who are still off,
yeah.
who may have been trapped outside the country in other circumstances. But not just the United States, but most other countries. Really, I'd want to see a very cautious approach to kind of resuming heavier amounts of travel between various countries, because I think in this country actually there still wasn't a particularly stringent set of rules put in place about quarantining people who've come off planes and checking and
Exactly.
testing people who arrived in the country,
Like,
and that's a real problem.
yes, because I mean that's fundamentally probably the most ridiculous thing about the response so far. Like, I don't know if you've actually seen the printout. They actually had a printout they were giving out to people at Heathrow Airport, where when you land there, they give you, amongst the stuff that you get when you get off the plane, they give you a sheet of paper that basically has the logo of Heathrow on it and so on. And in this document, they basically explain to you, and it starts out in like such a ridiculous way. Like, I think the first line of the article that they give you is you may be confused upon disembarking in Heathrow to find that you are not being subject to quarantine or even temperature testing, as you might have been in the airport that you departed from. And then they say the reason for this is not because Heathrow can't be bothered to do it. And I'm just summarizing here. The reason for this,
Yeah.
they claim, is not because Heathrow can't be bothered to do it, but rather because they are following the government position.
And
Which
the
is, I mean,
government position being you don't need
don't
to.
don't test, don't do temperatures, don't do anything, don't even do quarantine. Literally, people can just get off at Heathrow and walk literally into the country.
Now, the only assumption I can make, and I obviously don't know this for sure, but the only assumption that I can make is that the reason that the government would not have brought in this kind of a testing and quarantine and that sort of thing for people arriving at the airport, I'd assume it's probably got something to do with the fact that for a fair amount of time we had a severely lacking testing capacity in the country. And obviously, in order to be testing and checking all of those new arrivals that come in off the planes, in addition to all the other demands of testing right now, be it people on the healthcare front line or people who've made it into hospital or whatever,
Mhm.
I'm assuming that they hadn't got the capacity sorted in time, so they thought, right, well, let's just not bother trying. I mean, those are the dots that I'm connecting, for lack of a better explanation.
Yeah, a lot of
But
it does strike me as you can't get held to account for figures you don't bother to record.
what I was going to add, just to your earlier point about what the United States does, because obviously we spoke about the prospects of travel between the two countries. I think what's interesting about, because we've had reports of some protests in the UK about lifting the lockdown, but they've been very low level. Like 30 people gathering outside a building in London. Not an awfully large scale thing. I take it that in America there's probably a bit more of an organised movement for it, at least in certain states. But my rough understanding of that, obviously not being amazingly well versed in American politics, is I know there's more of a what would you call it? Sort of more of like a cultural zeitgeist over in the States about things like personal freedom, liberty, etc.
Yeah,
Very
for
sort
them
of
it's an ongoing argument as to where the boundary is between being an irresponsible idiot versus versus freedom. Because I mean they're literally just negotiating that boundary because they don't seem to understand that the virus doesn't care about whether you have a flag that has a snake that says "Don't tread on me" on it, right? And I think obviously in the case of the United Kingdom fortunately does not have this problem. Like that part of the debate does not exist. You don't have like a mass group of people who are all campaigning to have all of your defenses taken down. So I mean, I suppose
yeah.
that's some cause for optimism. Like I have a feeling that the United Kingdom can possibly get out of this crisis before the United States will.
I mean, in the UK, we've obviously still got some leading figures who've been dead set against the lockdown from the beginning. Certain commentators, at least, but yeah, it certainly seems we don't seem to quite have an equivalent either movement, organisation, or just a general feeling amongst the public on the same level as what there is in the States. I think by and large, most of the UK public appears fairly behind the lockdown and fairly compliant as well, with some obvious exceptions. But it
Yeah.
definitely seems to be a bit more of a contentious issue over in the States. And I was going to ask you, maybe you'll know better than I do. Do you think it's being fueled by the economic argument, being obviously the longer lockdowns in place, the more long-term damage it could do to the economy? Do you think it's more to do with purely this issue of personal freedoms and liberties, or do you think it's these conspiracy theories about
Yeah.
there is no coronavirus, it's
It
just the
depends on
flu, all that
it
sort
depends.
of thing?
I think it's all three of them are in play because I think that it depends on which group of people you ask. So obviously, conspiracy theorists are going to obviously bring to you the conspiracy theory, and then there are the
Yeah.
people who think it's all about the personal freedom thing because that's their wheelhouse for whatever reason. But I think the vast majority of people are presenting these short-term economic arguments in which their argument is basically that they think it should be somehow logical to allow a disease that they don't know what it does to wend its way through the entire population and then just kind of cross your fingers and hope that there are no long-term negative effects of this beyond the fact that you're going to have obviously mounting numbers of people in hospitals completely clogging up your medical system because there are just so many different levels of problem which can manifest from this. So the first problem, of course, is clogging up the healthcare system. I mean, obviously, we both agree that's completely, something we want to avoid. The second problem is that there are elements of of how the virus behaves that we don't know about. So at the beginning, a lot of authorities were claiming that the virus can only, will somehow magically only affect people over a certain age and not under a certain age, right? Except we now know that in some random instances, it can be extremely harmful to children as well. So this is basically, one of those things where people didn't know that, and now they do. Um, Other things that people didn't calculate for when they were talking about just letting the virus run through the population, Sweden style, was that you can have situations where the virus mutates and changes the way in which the spike protein is formed, which would then mess up your chances of being able to get an effective one-shot hits all vaccine. So this is one of those things where a lot of the precautions that people are taking is basically just buying the world enough time so that we can get to the vaccine stage of things without having mutations. Because the more bodies the virus can go through, the more opportunities it has to randomly mutate, which is what we don't want to let happen. And I think a lot of people in the economic argument don't understand how economically devastating it would be if the virus actually mutated in a way that allowed it to evade the human immune response.
Yeah, I'm largely going to agree with most of that. I'd say, I'd say in support of those who make the economic argument, it's obviously reasonable to also say, having an unprecedented, and it is fairly unprecedented, having an unprecedented shutdown of major, majorative segments of the economy and the knock-on effect that can have. Obviously, it's an incredibly drastic path to go down, and that is
Yeah,
going to have its own repercussions. But
of course,
but
of
I
course.
I fall on the same, So I just want to say that although I don't agree with people who cite that as their argument that there should be no lockdown, I at least understand roughly the area that they're concerned about. But I
Yeah.
would, I would largely side with you on this and say, especially in relation to the health service being overwhelmed, which I've got absolutely no doubt in my mind that if there had not been a lockdown or at least stringent social distancing measures put in place, or a large bulk of what we've had put in place here, that at this point in time the NHS would have been completely overwhelmed. They were building excess hospitals because of the anticipation of just how
Exactly.
many people they're going to be dealing with. So
And of course, the overwhelming thing has this negative feedback loop that can be created as well. Because of course, if the NHS becomes overwhelmed, it means that more doctors also become sick. So you have simultaneously more sick people and less doctors.
yeah,
And
exactly.
so that overwhelming can accelerate quite quickly. So they can't even just plot that on a graph and act like, okay, we know when the overwhelming will happen, because this assumes that they know when doctors and nurses may or may not become ill, which of course they can never know.
And obviously, because so much of this is unknown, there are elements of this where there will be unintended consequences, no matter which way you do things that you wouldn't expect. Something that I found very interesting that I was just looking into the other day was that some downsides of the lockdown are, unrelated to coronavirus or the economy, are things such as potentially a higher rate of suicide, a higher rate of people having tougher times with depression or domestic violence, being trapped in a home with an abusive spouse or something like
Oh
that.
yes,
But
very true.
those are obviously areas that the lockdown has made things worse. But then on the other side, again, unrelated to the economy or coronavirus, you have reporting that, well, because there's so many less cars on the road at the moment, there may well be less deaths this year due to pollution than there would have been otherwise. So I do find it, and I'm not making a point pro or anti-lockdown in that sense. I'm just citing a few things on either side that I've heard, because what I do find really interesting about this is just because so much of it is something that we've never done before. We've never dabbled in this kind of thing before either, that we're getting so many pros and cons appearing, both intended and unintended, of the courses of action we're taking. I think the one and probably the final point I make on this, just about the economic effects of the lockdown, is that most countries are in the same boat on this. It's not as if just the UK or just the US are looking at lockdowns and they're going to suffer economic damage whilst the rest of the world carries on as normal, and then we're far behind. Everyone's doing this in some shape or form. Everyone's going to take an economic hit in 2020. That just seems to be the playing field. So in a sense, there at least, it's somewhat more level.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so the other thing that I was going to ask you about as well is going to be a trade-related question, which has a link behind it. So I'll show you the link as well at some point, well, soon. But have you heard the way that some people have responded to this in terms of like advocacy of protectionism and advocacy of like erecting trade barriers? Do you agree that erecting trade barriers in the middle of the pandemic will actually slow down the ability of people to respond because of the fact that products won't get to where they need to be?
Oh, I mean, what exactly is the purpose of trade barriers, as the argument's being made by the people advocating for it?
No,
What do they hope to achieve?
the people who are advocating this unfortunate strategy is that they think that by erecting a barrier, it will enable them to somehow keep inside of their country more of the things that they think they need for tackling the crisis. However, at the same time, it also means that they're giving an incentive to countries which are not their own to also do the same thing. But of course, no one country seems to manufacture every single element of what they need in the crisis. And so you end up with the ridiculous situation of some people having some things, but not other things, and then other people having other things, but not some things.
I see what you're saying. Well, I mean, certainly we're right. Sort of, whether people like it or not, the current situation globally, at least, is a global economy where some
Exactly.
countries specialize in some things as opposed to others. So
So you would say to basically use the economy as it presently exists and leverage it so that, like, things that are needed in one place are shipped to the place they need to be shipped to by simply paying for them. I mean, to me, this seems
yeah,
quite obvious, but people are making it sound like it's complicated.
well, I'd say probably probably the other way that I'd frame the argument that some of these people are trying to make is say that I would want to see more emphasis on a degree of self-reliance within some of these economies. So for example,
Oh, yes, of
if we're
course.
if we're low on ventilators or PPE or things like that, encouraging businesses or factories or manufacturers
To
who are
produce them.
based in the country to produce them. Yeah,
Okay,
and
yeah,
obviously
that that
that's
we
a
both agree on for absolutely sure, which is that yes, the way to get more of the things you need to be in your country is to encourage production of them, not to basically erect barriers and have no one trading.
yeah. So I mean, I haven't come across a particularly good argument to say stop trading with other countries. I don't know whether I don't know whether this hypothetical argument might be, say, if there's a country that's known for manufacturing large amounts of PPE, and then the citizens of that country say, well, don't ship the PPE out elsewhere, keep it here because we need it more.
Ironically,
I could.
the administrations that seem to be making the argument for the protectionist position are the ones that actually would need to not have that position. So you've got you've got, like, for example, the U.S. administration making this kind of argument when they are the ones who are short on the product.
Well, I don't know. Again, I don't want to talk too far outside of what I've read up on, just because that's generally the sensible way to go about things. But
Yeah,
obviously, I'm
I'll show you the
aware
article.
that the
It would be a good opportunity to, like, test this out and make sure we haven't actually broken this platform anyway. So I'll try to show you the article and we'll see, like, how that plays out. So
oh, good stuff.
just give me a second. And
No problem. But just to add to that, what I was going to say is obviously I'm aware, in a broader sense, that Trump already has a sort of quite protectionist outlook on the economy, and prior to all this coronavirus, well, prior to the coronavirus pandemic, obviously he was engaging in the trade war with China anyway. So I wonder how much of this is just an
a
extension or a
continuation of that.
manifestation of what was already there. Yeah, that kind of
Yeah, so I
sentiment,
mean,
at least.
an extension of already existing bad ideas, basically.
Well, China, as Trump would say. How's that article looking then?
Yeah, it should probably come up now. You should be able to see it.
Oh, yeah,
Audience
here
should
we are.
also be able to see it now as well. So what I have to do is I just have to tell it to stay on that. Right. So on that, it should show global medical trade in the time of the coronavirus pandemic, and that's May 6, 2020. So I'm just going to scroll on to the part that's actually relevant. So is export restrictions will not protect the United States. One fallacy is that export restrictions will keep important medical supplies in the United States. The problem is that the United States, alongside about 70 countries, all have sought to protect their own access to medical supplies by prohibiting exports of medical equipment and supplies. Just one case in point, the Trump administration threatened to cut off Canada and Latin America from mask supplies through the authority of the Defense Production Act before the administration and US conglomerate 3M Company eventually negotiated the ability of 3M to serve both the US and export markets. Indeed, many countries have banned crucial medicine and personal protective equipment exports, disrupting the supply of key products that are needed everywhere and reducing life-saving gains from trade that would otherwise be possible due to the variation across the countries in peak need. Export restrictions during pandemics are a near-perfect example of a prisoner's dilemma. From one country's perspective, it may be optimal to restrict your exports, regardless of what your trading partner does. Yet if every country restricts exports, then it reduces the gains from trade for everyone and risks humanitarian disaster in the many countries without native medical supplies industries. So I'm not going to read the whole article, obviously, but I think they would be correct.
Yeah, I see the overall point that's being made. I guess then if I was just going to give like a broad stroke, a broad brush stroke answer to all that, I'd say it's those safety videos they play on planes when you're going to go flying, and it says, in event of an emergency, do not attempt to put a mask on your child until you have adjusted your own mask, or something along those lines. I think, and I understand the prisoner's dilemma aspects of it as well. I think it's reasonable that the public of any country would like to know that their government and the rules being put in place are ensuring that they have what they need. That's fundamental, basically.
Yeah.
But then
And
obviously,
so it's kind of like a perversion of this instinct, which is causing people to automatically buckle down. Because this is the thing about trade. A lot of the things that are the correct trade policies are things that run counter to what humans intuitively would want to do.
Yeah, and I'm speaking in the abstract here a little bit rather than specifically the US, but I'd say that if there was a country that had for example, ventilators. If there was a country that had all the ventilators they'd likely need for hospitals, social care, responding to the coronavirus, and then they had more ventilators, excess ventilators that they could then go on to export and sell on the global market, I'd say absolutely fair enough. You know, go for it, because those ventilators are just gathering dust at home. But if it's the situation that you still have reports of serious shortages and people not being able to get what they need, at that point in time, I probably would say, well, is it the wisest thing to have X amount of ventilators set for export when they're already in a country where they're presently needed? If that makes sense. So I can
In
understand.
that kind of case, if they've already been bought up by your own side, then they've been bought up, basically. So yeah, I agree with you on that. The most of the argument that people are making is people essentially hoarding the items and preventing them from being exported in cases where the virus has not impacted them as dramatically yet, but places that are in more urgent need would ordinarily be the ones actually being able to buy them.
Yeah,
Because that way
and that
you end up with the stock being allocated to the position where it should be at that time, and not having just one person sitting on the wall.
you basically end up with the international version of everybody buying up all the toilet roll in the supermarkets.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
And of course, the memes for that were truly amazing. Like ones where it's just like, protecting from coronavirus, and it's just like, the person's entire front wall in their garden. It's just nothing but toilet rolls.
It was remarkable in a way just to see, okay, the crisis finally hits, something that no one has ever witnessed in their lifetime. What do people do? What is the response? The answer
And
we finally
that was
get
the
is
response. It was
stop
truly
piling
insane.
toilet paper. Yeah. Of all the things, yeah, stop piling
Yeah.
toilet paper.
It was one of those things where, perhaps like one person might have triggered that whole thing, right? And then once it starts, you can't get it to stop, because then everyone's kind of like wondering where that item is. So I often wonder whether it could have been
Absolutely.
like any random item. Like, for instance, like what if it had turned out to be something like cheese? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Like if a certain other item had kind of had the meme made of it, so to speak.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there were other sort of high demand items, at least in this country. Off the top of my head, I think it was toilet roll, hand
Sanitizer
sanitizer,
disappeared.
and pasta as well, for that matter.
Yeah.
Like just bags and bags of pasta.
Rice
Um,
also started to disappear too.
oh yeah. Basically any sort of like long life.
Yeah. And
Well,
weirdly
actually, I
enough,
say that.
short life
I
stuff
say
disappeared too. Even wraps, for example, wraps were disappearing.
that's what I was going to get to. Yeah, that there was lots of long life stuff disappearing, but I had seen pictures of the odd supermarket here and there where people had just gone and completely wiped out all the fresh fruit and veg as well. And you think, well,
Yeah.
either you're making a big old salad or stew tonight, or that's just
Or
going to be a
all of that's
waste,
going to end up in a skip. Yeah, they later
Yeah,
discovered that a large amount of stuff that people had bought fresh in bulk ended up just in a skip.
which is obviously no good.
Exactly, extremely sad.
But I do think, yeah, it's a genuine sort of snowballing effect. I think the moment you start to hear murmurings either on social media or on the news of, oh, people are panic buying this, that, and the other, suddenly you and your household think to yourselves, maybe even if you weren't predisposed in the first place to say we should stockpile, if suddenly you hear perhaps there's a scarcity of those items out there, then suddenly you've got to think, oh, well, maybe I've got some now, but will I be able to get some in a week's time or 2 weeks' time? And then you go out and buy some as well, and it just adds to the problem. And that's how this thing just can get out of hand so quickly, because it really was in the space of less than a week. We went to all of the shops having to ration out some of these items, only 2 per customer.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Asda has been basically doing that, where they've got a limit of 3 items. This is even in the online store. You can only buy 3 items at a time of any one given item. The other thing which I've noticed is the extent to which the logistical networks that manage online delivery have been so clogged that you have to kind of plan your delivery roughly a week and a half in advance, because that's when it's going to come.
Oh, massively, yeah.
Yeah, there's
And
no more order and
anecdotally,
get it tomorrow. There's no more just ordering and getting it tomorrow. You have to wait literally a week and a half now.
Yeah, yeah, that would be the minimum. And anecdotally, at least, I've also heard of people being told they may not get deliveries until a
Ever.
month. Yeah, that long. So again, yeah, that's just another. It's just another very interesting example of how how the regular structures buckle when it comes to this kind of situation. But especially again, I think there's a social science element behind it, because maybe a little bit like with the stockpiling, if you were to say to everyone, well, you don't all need to order a big food shop online right now. If everyone had agreed, let's order things at roughly the same amount that we'd ordered them
That they would normally
previously.
would do. Yeah, I mean, this
Yeah,
is what I was doing at first as well, because I thought to myself, okay, I don't want to be the one that like breaks the system, so I'm just going to pretend for a while that everything is normal, and I'm going to essentially tell the online shopping people that like we're just doing it every 2 weeks, and then I realized, no one else seems to be doing this. They're just clowning me.
everyone else is panicking, so I need to out panic them, otherwise I'm going to be
Exactly.
left alone. Yeah,
Prisoner's dilemma. Basically, you get punished for playing for playing it responsibly.
there we are. Yeah. But we appear to be on the cusp. Well, I think in the UK and the US, if I'm correct, because this Sunday we're set to get a message from Boris Johnson
Oh
about
gosh,
the very beginning of some of these restrictions being lifted. And as far as I understand, over in the States,
they're
it's
trying
been
to do
left
it
up
too.
to has it been left up to individual states to decide for themselves
Yes.
what rate they lift the lockdown at? Yeah.
Yeah, basically.
I see. Well, I mean that will probably be interesting in itself as well, because thus far in terms of like an international picture, obviously like Sweden is the go-to that people cite for a country that hasn't imposed a strict lockdown. So obviously people's eyes are going to be on the contrast between Sweden and other countries to see if we can get any kind of sense of whether a stronger or a looser lockdown would have been the right course. But in America, I guess what will be interesting is that, given it's going to be left up, and it has been left up to the states most of the way through this process, as far as my understanding is, that the governors have been given quite a lot of autonomy.
Hmm.
Um, that's going to be interesting, just for looking at the difference between these states responded this way, these ones responded another way. Was it better to lift it earlier? Should it have been kept in place longer? It's kind of like a grand experiment in a way, if it weren't for the fact that the consequences are so very real life.
Incredibly dire. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm anticipating that the November election in the US is going to end up being a referendum on sort of, how the different parties, well, there's only two of them, but how the two parties have handled the COVID-19 crisis and how they've signaled on it as well.
Yeah, my assumption, pretty much since Trump got elected in 2016 or whenever it was, but my assumption, long running assumption, had been that Trump was going to win a second term and get re-elected. But then when coronavirus came along, I basically thought it's now kind of Trump's election to lose. A little bit like you said, with it being a referendum almost on the response to coronavirus. I think that if a bulk of the American, and I know the American public's very divided on the issue of Trump and coronavirus and so many other things anyway, but if by and large Trump is seen to have steered the country well through the crisis, not just by supporters but by floating voters, I guess they're the ones that matter in this kind of thing, then he'll win that second term. But if it goes catastrophically badly and he actually ends up absorbing some of the blame for that, that might be the factor that causes his undoing. But of course, you've also got Joe Biden to contend with.
Yeah,
And I mean, I don't know what your thoughts on Joe Biden are. I'm not sure if we've discussed that one before.
we
Um,
haven't, but I mean, there are several weaknesses that I think that Biden suffers from, and it's a question of whether he can overcome these in key voting districts. So, I mean, the way the polls look, it looks on paper like if he's overcoming like things that other candidates would have struggled with in specific electoral districts that lean in his direction. But I mean, we remember from last time that polls are not always exactly accurate. So we might be actually just viewing a wonderland right now, and it might actually not, and it might actually not be real. And this is the thing that I'm worrying about.
Yeah, I mean, all I've got to go on at the moment, in part, because I do tend to pay more attention to the American election, but it will normally only be within the last couple of months of run up to the vote itself. But what my instincts are telling me right now is that if you get a head-to-head debate situation between Trump and Biden, I imagine that Trump's probably going to destroy him. Just given we know what Trump is like and the way he goes about this sort of thing. I mean, 4 or 5 years ago, he was up against a field of 20 odd other Republican candidates, and he came up with his nicknames for them, and he was always the loudest one on stage, and whatever he'd say, controversial or not, he'd get the most attention and airtime. And with Biden, all he really needs to do in the middle of a debate is just pick apart 1 or 2 times that Joe gets a little bit foggy-headed and loses where he's at, and goes, "Oh, sleepy Joe doesn't know how to run the country," that sort of thing, and that'll kind of be Trump sealing the deal with his usual strategy on the matter.
Yeah, I mean, it remains to be seen how that plays with voters, because obviously Biden has his own way of talking as well, which can be quite aggressive. That thing where he'll have he'll be like something 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 man, etc. Right? Or he'll do that thing where he'll say that the other person is talking complete malarkey, etc. etc. So I mean, Biden also has an aggressive style. It's just a question of which aggressive style is going to be seen as more credible and which is going to be seen as completely bumbling, and it could go either way.
Yeah, I think that in a sense it would be so much better for the prospects of the Democrats if they had a. I don't know. I'm not trying to say necessarily that if Bernie Sanders had got the nomination, for example, he would have been a dead set to beat Trump.
Yeah, because I mean, he was polling in the wrong way in some of the key electoral districts, because the places where Biden needs to essentially take votes that would have gone to Trump, Biden would have found them almost impossible to get them to do that because of the fact that he's literally self-describing as a socialist in the election. I mean, Elizabeth Warren would have suffered from roughly the same thing, because I mean, her poll figures were not better than Sanders on that issue. And then if we go back further to people who dropped out earlier on, I mean, Kamala Harris seemed to suffer from a similar problem, although she didn't have complete poll figures for every single location that I remember having seen, because I mean, she didn't actually go on for long enough for that to occur. But I kind of feel like the kind of people who were on the fence about whether they should vote for Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton in 2016 are the same kind of people who are probably more likely to consider a vote for Biden than they would for any of the other Democratic candidates that were on show.
I mean that's an interesting way of looking at it, actually. I think partly I'd been thinking in terms of by and large, from what I've observed, most Republicans seem to be either behind Trump or at the very least behind Trump for the purposes of not allowing a Democrat to get in. But since Biden got the nomination, and again, I do have to be very careful here because we were only talking earlier on about Twitter not necessarily being representative of the larger public. So that is something I need to keep in mind. But at least from observations on what I'd call like the Bernie Sanders wing or the sort of the more progressive wing of the Democrats, it seems that there's certainly a divide out there between people who want to back Biden in order to beat Trump, or because they support him anyway, and those who would refuse to do so either because of his policies or because of the allegations that have been made against him. So I'd probably just have to wonder how that will manifest in terms of people turning out. But again, I do have to be careful because it's Twitter. It might not be representative.
It might not play out precisely that way. So I think we've reached roughly somewhere around the 2/3 point now. So what we'll do is we'll go to a break, and then when we come out from the break, we're going to look into this political values test that you took.
Okay, sounds good to me.
Okay, so I'll just tell you when we're in break. Give me a second.
Right, so I understand that we're now going to be taking a look at a couple of tests that I did. I think it was yesterday, called the right values test and the left values test, which um, I suppose part of the same category of tests as the political compass that people might know about, where you answer various questions on political positions, usually strongly agree to strongly disagree, and then it puts it through an algorithm and tells you where you ought to be on the political spectrum. So I posted this to Twitter yesterday, and that was what prompted you to get in touch, actually, that you're
Yeah.
interested, amongst other things, to discuss this.
Yes. So I'll bring it up on screen, and then we'll go through it, and it'll probably take us about roughly 10 to 15 minutes, and then we can kind of wrap up the stream and basically call it a success. So I'll just do that now. Hold on one second.
Which one would you like to start with? Do you want to start with left values or right values?
Yeah, I think I'll start with the left values one. So hold on. We're just going to go sharing the screen and application window. I need to make this a one-click process. Probably make this a lot quicker. Okay, so sharing. So that should now display Twitter for us. So this is what you wrote. So you said my left values and right values test results: social democracy and center-rightism. Highest ideology matching score in each was centrist Marxism and Georgism, and the lowest were eco-anarchism and Nazism. Obviously.
Always relieving to know that you're 0% Nazi, by the way.
Pretty
Very
much.
reassuring. Yeah.
0% Nazi. So that was fantastic. So what I'll do is I'll just bring up the left values one first that you had. So that's gonna load now. Yeah. So we're just gonna go through each one of these. I like how Twitter has changed the way that it displays these things as well, where it has the inset part on the side now, so you can actually see what the person was writing while also displaying the image.
Yeah, that's a recent change, isn't it? I don't think I've seen that yet.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's really good. Right, so I mean, the top one you've got there is reformist.
Yeah, reformist as opposed to revolution. So I suppose that one is fairly self-explanatory. I think the test was asking me questions like, in order to bring down capitalism, is a violent revolution acceptable? And stuff along those kind of lines. Can you, because they were framing it very much in terms of socialism, but it was things like, can you achieve socialism or social change within democratic structures or working within capitalism and things like that? And generally speaking, I'm against the idea of, well, I wouldn't want to go as far as like in an extreme, an abstract way, say I'm against the idea of revolutions full stop, because God knows there may well be tyrannical situations where a revolution is probably the best course of action. But at the very least, I don't think for the purpose of changing our economic system as it currently exists, the best way to do that is some kind of a violent uprising and a toppling of governments, because it leaves a hell of a lot of uncertainty about what's going to replace it, whether what replaces it will work, and even whether or not the right people end up taking the reins over after the last lot have been booted out. So generally, I'm very much in favour of trying to, as frustrating and banging your head against the wall as it can be from time to time, trying to achieve things.
In a gradualist fashion can often turn out to be more stable than trying to do it all in one step.
Yes, that's probably the best way to put it. And obviously, personally, I'm not entirely sure if I'd want to necessarily arrive. I'm not sure if I'd pluck full-blooded red socialism out of the air per se and say this is the destination I want to arrive at. I think I'm much more minded to say, right, implement some slightly more socially democratic policies than what we have at the moment, and do they have the effects that people want to see, and do they actually produce results, and then see where we're at, and then see what's appropriate. I used to be like this a few years ago, but I'm
so reasonable, and this is one of those things where your reasonableness leads directly into you being trolled by the usual suspects, where basically you're going to come and say, let's change society to improve it somewhat, and then someone is going to come out of a well and they're going to say to you, but you live in a society.
Haha, but yeah.
Very intelligent. So no, obviously I agree. Obviously I agree with you.
Yeah, and obviously it's not to say that I may have all the answers of how to improve society, and it's not to say that there aren't you know quite seriously well embedded vested interests out there, which are very well guarded against certain types of reform and change. But as I said, just to reiterate, as a rule, proposing some kind of a grand revolution to upturn the entire system, um, I think rarely does history offer many examples of that going as people plan.
Yeah. Okay, so the second element of this. So apparently the test says that you were neutral on the scientific versus utopian scale. So what kind of questions did you
Yes.
have to answer to get to that point?
I'm trying to think what questions pertains to this one exactly. I wonder whether or not it's trying to balance I don't know if it's science versus utopianism, whether it's trying to balance some kind of an ideological approach.
Yeah, that's what it looks like to me, because the scientific side has like an outline of Karl Marx's face, whereas the utopian side just has a rose.
Yeah. So all I can infer from that, I guess, is that perhaps I'm a little bit idealistic, but
Yeah.
not fully ideological. Maybe that's the way to put it.
Yeah. I mean, it'd be a case of like you're not a tanky, and also and also at the same
No, no.
time.
I'm not. I'm not a tanky, but I'm not quite a pro-market neoliberal either. Probably somewhere in the
Exactly.
middle between
Somewhere
that.
in the
Yeah,
middle of that, the happy middle.
yeah,
Okay, and so the second one, it seems quite similar again. You're neutral, where it has the one on the left here depicting what seems to be democratic centralism, and the one on the other side being anarchy.
yeah. Now I'm trying to think whether that pertains to political structuring or management of the economy, or it may have been both for that matter.
It would end up it would probably end up covering both of them, because I'm assuming if someone was like a democratic centralist, like 100%, then they're basically operating new economic policy under Lenin. Whereas if they're on the other side of that, that one, the one that's basically anarchy, then I assume that there is just no authority compelling people to do anything.
Yeah, so I guess I mean I may not be able to say much for the questions, but I can at least outline my overall views on the thing. I think that first of all, I think democracy is the way to go. I'm very much in favour of living within a democratic system as opposed to something else, as imperfect as the form of it that we have at the moment may be. I think that the highest level or the highest authority of our democracy or government, however you want to put it, ought to be the government of the United Kingdom, which is where my Euroscepticism comes into play. That I'm somewhat resistant to the idea of having to do it on a on a partial basis in collaboration with other European countries, and that very much is a political economic outlook rather than something to do with the fact that they're French and German. You know, because I know that view sometimes exists as a result of Brexit. Some people out there still tend to think, oh, it's because you don't like foreigners or something like that, but it's really not. But within that, I'd say, yeah, I think that the government of the United Kingdom ought to be the highest authority that governs it, allowing room for some devolved decision making, pretty much as the setup exists at the moment. And then, in regards to the economy, at least, I'd standard social democrat, really. I believe it's sort of a bit of the mix between public and private. I think some things ought to be overseen by the state. Certainly, the health service, probably the best example, but it's not to say that they're necessarily. I certainly don't ascribe to what I'd say some of the hard left views that ultimately everything ought to be brought into some kind of public ownership. I'm not really sold on that.
Okay, fair enough. So, yeah, I can see how they managed to put you in neutrality on that, and you have basically a pretty balanced view of this. So on the next one, the fourth one, they have international versus national, and again, you are pretty much down the middle on this, which I think
Pretty
is a
much,
sensible position to be in.
in fact, nearly Brexit levels of divide there, because we infamously had the 52 and the 48.
46, 53, yeah, it's pretty close.
Yeah, not that far off. Yeah, so probably no surprise that I've come down the middle there as well. My we'll describe it as my nationalism and my internationalism, for lack of better words, I suppose. My nationalism comes in the form of saying, it's the United Kingdom that I live in. More so than other people in the world, it's probably people from the United Kingdom I identify with and would, at the very least, place myself in the same group of saying we are one unit of people under a government that determines itself democratically. And like we were saying earlier about the procurement of medical services or whatever, there is a sense of, because this is the unit of people we're dealing with, there needs to be a base element of looking out for the people within that group, the people who live within the country. But then beyond that, and probably Brexit will factor into that as well, just in terms of a bit of autonomy and self-determination. But beyond that, I'm not one of these people who thinks that all of the foreign aid should be cut. I'd still like to see us participating in, charity, trying to lead the way in research in areas, collaborating with other countries. I tend to watch the Eurovision Song Contest, even though I think it's absolutely awful every year, and I question why I do it. I like the idea of the country governing itself and having a fairly clear identity of we are Brits within the United Kingdom. But it's certainly not to say I think we should, completely pull ourselves away from the global stage and say, right, we're doing our thing and we're not participating anymore. Does that make sense? Kind of where I kind of lie on the middle ground of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm often accused of occupying that exact same position, that middle ground between, understanding the utility of national sovereignty and local government in many cases, but also at the same time still having the international perspective.
That's it, yeah. I guess the best way I'd like to describe it is just that I'd like to see us cooperating with other countries, acting to try and improve things on a global level, or at least for countries that are doing, still developing and things like that. But I want that from the vantage point of a independent country choosing to do those things rather than a country that is already part of a larger structure that has to, because the decision's out of their hands.
Okay, so the next one was rating you as partisan. So you seem to lean more in favor of party than union on the next one. So number 5.
Yeah. Well, I think it's probably, given that this was the left values test, it was very much hyper focused in on, kind of maybe where the left wing topics of debate and differences are.
So like how the labour laws are being actually created, then would they be mostly originating from unions engaged in collective action, or would the party be laying down particular regulations which they already believe are the ones that are necessary?
I think where the divide is on this is, at least the thought process behind the questioning was whether you identify more with trade unions or the political parties that are set up that profess to represent the interests of trade unions.
Okay, and so that's basically 63-36. I mean, I would expect that to be the normal result that you would get, if because of the fact that it's already showing earlier that you're not an anarchist, right? So I'm assuming that let's say that you are leaning more in the anarchy direction instead of being neutral on the point from earlier, then it might have been the other way around, where you'd be saying that, okay, well, the state has a minimized role and unions themselves regulate these things internally. Now, obviously, there are plenty of libertarian socialist movements which might have done that, but obviously I don't make a judgment either way. Like, some people want to do it via the party, some people want to do it with the unions in front. It really depends on like what your national tradition is and what the situation on the ground looks like. So I think in the context of the United Kingdom, that is a normal result.
And probably just to add to that, I'd say that some questions more than others in the test may have been ones that I was more likely to give a neutral response on, sort of a clear one way or the other. And I think maybe this is one of those examples, because I don't think I've got amazingly well developed thoughts at the moment on necessarily the level of involvement of unions within left party politics, or the way the two ought to play off against one another. So probably the balance was struck with a few more don't knows than anything else, I'd imagine.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I can imagine that. Okay, and then on the other one, you've got literally a square 50-50 here, neutral between production and nature. So, sort of
Wow.
like,
Oh,
neither Sonic the Hedgehog nor Dr. Eggman.
I was going to say Thanos would be proud, wouldn't he? Perfectly balanced. That's all things should be. Yeah, so I think these questions pertained to things like, well, basically, I imagine the effects that industry has on the environment. Obviously, you can have technological advances and improving the economy, but the downside of that will be obviously creating pollution and creating a lot of waste. And then the flip side being you can have laws and regulations brought in to trying to curb that sort of thing, but then that can sometimes damage economic advancement. So I think the questions that I was asked were, about the importance of responding to climate change, about whether or not I supported trying to ease back on fossil fuels and bringing in renewables, questions along those kinds of lines. And I suppose I think the way that I answered it, especially if it ends up being 50-50, is to say that I think we do need to take steps in order to try and address
Yeah.
climate change and the effects on the environment, but not to say, in the same sense, maybe that I'm
Development
not
of,
a.
of technology is one of the tools that can help us to overcome the limitations that we previously had, and that you wouldn't. So, let me put it this way: in terms of the shades of green, because you've seen the green movement has obviously several factions within it, you'd be less of a deep green type, and you'd be more of a bright green type. In other words, you believe that we can technologically innovate solutions to the climate change problem.
Yes, I'd probably describe myself as that way of thinking.
Okay,
And
coincidence. Me too.
oh well, there we are then. Yeah, and that makes the most sense to me, really. That no doubt, as new advancements are made and we get better ideas of how we can go about. I mean, it was only when was it 40 odd years ago, maybe, that recycling really came into its own and became a concept that people were
Yeah,
largely aware of. Um, and that's just simply, reusing the same materials to repurpose them. And to think the changes that there have been just from previously not having done that to suddenly being able to recycle, and the way that reduces landfill. So I'm sure that in enough time we will have better solutions for cleaner, more sustainable energy. I don't expect them all to arrive overnight. But again, if I'm going to frame myself, as it seems to be most of these results, as the eternal centrist between one point and the other, I'd say I'd like to see us moving away from things like fossil fuels and towards renewables, but I wouldn't quite go as far on the environmental argument to say we need to ground all the planes now.
exactly, exactly.
I'm not full Extinction Rebellion or anything like that.
Exactly, and I think one of those things is that if you inhibit the economy too much in the way that you go about doing it, you hamper your ability to develop the solutions that you need. Like, it's how do
Well,
you get to a? It's like a question of, like, how do you get to a solar panel or a hydrogen society without first going through the prerequisite economic development with non-renewable sources ahead of time. It's almost like you had to burn oil and gas first in order to learn how to not do it.
is it time for me to pop out of a little pipe and say, "Aha! You say we shouldn't burn we shouldn't burn oil and gas, yet you live in a
And yet you live in
society
a
that burns
society
oil
in
and
which
gas."
that happens. It's one of those things where it's like, yeah, I mean, people just need to realize that sometimes you have to pass through the process. It's one of those things that we had to do.
Yeah,
Um, the last one on this as well. So you're neutral between progressive and conservative, which is something that I would expect, given that you're also 75% reformist at the top here as well. So this is one of those things where I'm going to make an assumption, and you tell me whether I've got it right.
yeah.
The reason why you come down basically down the middle on that is because your instincts are toward progressive values, where politically possible, but you understand that you have to pace yourself so that you don't end up eliciting a backlash that was unwanted.
Yeah. I'd say that's a pretty accurate way of putting it. I've long considered myself. Well, I've long considered myself on the left, first of all, whether we're talking about in an economic or a social sense.
Mhm.
But I do think that increasingly over the last few years, I've become more aware of what I describe as you know, whether or not we're going to use the label social justice warriors or not, I don't know whether it's particularly useful. But the point being, people who take the causes of fighting racism or sexism or trying to promote equality or you know, this, that, and the other stuff that I very much agree with, but they seem to take it to a very extreme degree, almost like the nth degree that they can. Everything often needs to be an absolute of one thing or the other. There's rarely room for nuance. And yes, like you'd kind of said in your appraisal of where I stand on it, sometimes there's not a lot of tolerance for bringing other people with you. Sometimes it's like, this is what we believe. This is the new correct thing to believe. If you don't believe it now, you're a bigot. Story's over, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the major problems of the progressive left, that sometimes they'll spend more time within sort of an echo chamber of sorts with other people that agree with that very specific outlook on things, that when it makes actual contacts with the wider public, it kind of just dissolves away rather quickly.
The same way that they expected it would. I mean, I was in a live stream just yesterday in which we discussed that as well, which is that there are not enough discussions going on between people who are on the progressive side and people who are just in the middle and haven't formed an opinion yet. Right? A lot of the times you end up with these weird conversations where someone who already knows what they're talking about will encounter someone who has never heard of a particular topic. And then if you're like, I have no idea what you're talking about, explain this to me, they'll be like, read the source text, we're not here to educate you, or whatever. Which then kind of drives the person away because now they've got that negative reaction that they didn't even expect.
Oh, yeah, I think I know what you're driving at there. But there can be certain you know, I don't know whether you'd call it like identity groups, or at least people who are specialised in certain kinds of arguments about certain
and then
types
they come
of
upon someone who hasn't got a clue about that particular thing, not due to any fault of their own, but rather because they just haven't encountered that particular topic before, and then they get dunked on for not knowing what the other guys were talking about.
Yeah, and again, that's probably a good example of what we're talking about, of just people not being able to relate some of those arguments to people as well as they might do otherwise. But I just say,
I sympathise with your position there, which is, you know, you've got to. It's one of those things where people have got to put in the work.
Yeah, I think people have got to put in the work. And you know, here's the thing: there'll be people on the progressive end of politics who obviously, and you know, rightly so, as far as they're concerned, won't really want to have much to do with people who are genuinely on the far right or on the fascist end, or
I'm talking about
you know,
people in the middle, of course. In the people
or people with rather abhorrent views. And you're absolutely right. But I think one of the great problems, at least from what I've just observed of going around and talking to quite a few different people from having doing this YouTube, is it tends to be that the more firmly in a certain camp you are, whether it's the progressive camp or the, I don't know, we'll call it the conservative or traditional camp or whatever, however firmly implanted you are in that side, it tends to be that you'll see the extremes of the other side more and more easily in what I'd call the middle ground people. That tends to happen more often. I think there's a propensity of people on the very hard right to be quick to label everyone as a communist, for example, but then people on the very hard left to be a lot more inclined to call everyone a fascist.
Exactly. Like, you kind of raise your eyebrow at someone and you're immediately accused of being the extremist on the other side of whatever they are. So at the bottom of this result, it tells you that your closest match is social democracy, which is exactly what you put in your introduction card. So not surprised there.
No surprise. That sounds about right to me. It's not to say that whatever. This is the one thing that I am always cautious about when placing any kind of a political or ideological label on myself. I often feel that then there's a requirement to have to defend it in a certain form. You know, so say if there's, I don't know, 10 or 20 specific tenets that are supposed to make up this is what a social democrat believes. And then someone will say, oh, but Captain Swiss, you believe in this, but you don't believe in that, so you're not a real social democrat. Or you know, it could apply to any label. Just to make clear, I'm not interested in saying I am the definitive point of a certain ideology, but just if we've got to use words out there to describe where we sit on the spectrum, I think social democrat works the best, really. I am a Democrat. I do want to see a strong social safety net and some state involvement in things. It seems a fitting enough label to me.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll just go quickly to the next one now as well, which is obviously the right values one, where they're trying to rate you on the basis of, well, the ideology you don't hold, which is kind of interesting. So,
Yeah.
so, so on this one, obviously neutral at the top, where they've got reform versus conserve. So it's basically just similar to the previous one, where you're down the middle on that one as well. And then they have on the second one neutral between intervention versus laissez-faire, which is again literally a reproduction of the left one, except I guess it's not quite a good fit for what they're measuring, given that they're measuring you in the wrong spectrum.
That's true. I mean, I think we've got, let's say it's 58 on interventionism. So, yeah, 50-50. Again, whether it's going to be like interventionism versus laissez-faire or whatever the metric on the other test was, it kind of just on a
Yeah,
larger scale represents, I believe, in a mix between public and private as the way to
exactly.
look for it. Yeah.
And then on the Democratic part, obviously, you're at 61% constitution and 38% what they refer to as, quote, dictatorship, whatever that means in this context.
I guess maybe if you think about like a traditional political compass, there's obviously the
Authoritarian versus libertarian.
authoritarian, yeah, that
Yeah.
axis of
So,
things.
so
So
yeah, it is the same axis on the other side anyway. Like if I flip that over, just hold on. If I just flick it back over, what is the third one on the other one? Central versus decentral. Yeah, I mean it's literally just that axis relabeled and flipped the other way around.
yeah, so constitution versus dictatorship. I guess the way to summarize that is that I
You
believe that
like
obviously.
constitutions and not dictatorships, pretty
Well,
much.
yeah, definitely. I'd like to not live in a dictatorship. There's a very obvious answer for you. But
Exactly.
to drill into it just a little bit more, probably to say that I think democracy is the best way to go. I think that there are certain freedoms and liberties that people are entitled to that ought to be upheld, but obviously there's give and take within a state and within a system, and you do obviously have to have some degree of authority placed within a government to be able to govern, and apparatus of the state, such as the police, to enforce laws and things. So, you need to strike a balance between the two, essentially, don't you?
Yeah. Okay, so on the fourth one, it's peace versus morality. And so obviously the one on morality, they've got the NATO logo, and then the peace one is obviously the peace symbol. So again, you're right down the middle on this one. So I'm assuming that this is kind of like the test is measuring an indicator that you prefer to have peace on a normal day, but there are instances in which you believe that there needs to be intervention on a moral basis on people who are committing crimes against humanity. So, for example, I assume that you would have been okay with Tony Blair's actions in Sierra Leone, for example.
It's very interesting, actually, that the two ends of that are peace and morality, because they're not things that I'd necessarily consider to be opposites to one another. If
Yeah, I
that
mean, I
makes
think
sense.
the way that they understand that, because I mean, obviously, peace is also moral, but I mean, what they mean by morality in this case seems to be um, exporting that morality to a different situation other than your own country. Because when you're in the right spectrum, there's
Understood.
always that viewpoint that, oh, the boundaries of your own borders are what contain where you're allowed to have your jurisdiction, which is kind of a weird thing. Because again, this is one of those things where I think only right wingers believe this.
Yeah, I'd say then, just to give a rough summary on that, then, I'd say that my instincts tend to be anti-interventionist, um, but I'd almost call that the starting block, if that makes sense. Like
Exactly. Because
that's
there
the
are things that
default
would
position
cause you to need
almost.
to intervene.
Yeah. I can certainly think of scenarios where ultimately I'd think, okay, I think that our country's involvement in this is going to be to the benefit. But more often than not, I'd sooner see us lead the way doing things like aid, or
Yeah.
trying to support negotiations, or trying to assist in other countries solving disputes with peaceful means or whatever,
Okay. Yeah.
rather than the first response obviously being, right, let's just desert storm up in this and
Yeah.
cut the head off and see what happens.
Watch chaos emerge, right? Just like chaos is a ladder. And then it's like, a couple of years later, everyone's like, no, maybe not.
Yeah, so that probably in a nutshell is how I guess I'd put it. I can look to things going on around the world, and I can I can see that they're wrong, and I can sometimes instinctively feel that stuff ought to be done about them. But
Yeah.
it's got to be contextual. I don't think you can have a firm rule in place one way or the other to say either never get involved or always get involved.
Exactly, exactly. And then, of course, on the other one, this seems to be a religious style question. So it's a question of like, do you have separation of religion and state, or do you support a theocracy? So obviously, they're saying 66.7% separation, the 33.3% is the theocratic element, which I assume is just the test measuring the fact that you think religion should exist.
Yeah, I think it's probably measuring my views on religion and also the prominence or protections that religion are
Exactly,
given in
exactly.
relation to the state. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
So we're,
my,
we're
my
probably in full agreement on this one as well, which is that obviously, people have the right to practice their faith as they see fit, so long as it does not infringe on the rights of others or violate the Constitution.
Yeah, I'd say so in a nutshell. I'm of the view that people should be free to practice their religions as long as not as a result of that they're quite seriously harming people or breaking the law in serious ways. Um,
Exactly.
I don't think, and this obviously puts me slightly counter to the current setup in the UK actually, because we've still got quite significant roles for the Church of England, and obviously I think
Yes,
people
they're
have.
still in the House of Lords.
Yeah, certain religious figures in the House of Lords and the rest of it. So, my view is that I'd like to see religion. Sorry. I'd like to see religious institutions and political institutions kept apart from one another. I was about to say religion and politics, but I wouldn't go that far. Actually, I think that it's reasonable enough out there. I mean, I'm not religious myself, but it's reasonable enough out there that there will be people who are religious, and it will influence their
Impact the way
politics
that they
for
think in
better and
some
for
way.
worse. Yeah,
Yeah.
and that can't be helped. And I think in a society that says we allow different religions and different viewpoints, that's reasonable. But certainly, as far as the institutions are concerned, I think the two should be kept pretty firmly
Yeah.
separate.
The next one seems to feed back into what we were saying earlier. So I'm just going to flip back over to the other one, where you can see there you're neutral between production and nature. And then we had a conversation about that, where we came to the conclusion that, of course, your reason for coming up neutral on that was that you believe that developing greater productive forces, more technology enables you to conserve nature in ways that you couldn't have at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And then we see here in the results on the right hand side, accelerate versus decelerate. You're more in favor of acceleration and less in favor of deceleration, which is exactly what I would expect.
Yeah, and again, maybe I'm a tad puzzled on some of these questions. I think again they were about uh, putting the brakes on industry for environmental concerns, or they may have also pertained to things like whether or not countries ought to be moving towards like zero growth models rather than focusing on increases in GDP. But I'm perhaps grasping at straws trying to remember
No,
what the
I can
questions
imagine.
were.
I can imagine that would have been one of the questions because deceleration would definitely take you toward the zero growth scenario. But I mean, obviously, from what we discussed earlier, we both agree already that more growth is necessary because the products of that growth can then be used to conserve the environment in ways that were not previously possible.
Yeah,
Rather than just, I mean,
and
you literally said it earlier as well that you weren't supporting Extinction Rebellion's position of just stopping air travel and stopping, the everyday things that get the economy to take over in the belief that somehow this will save the economy.
no, I
Sorry,
wouldn't do so.
somehow this will save the environment. I mean,
Yeah, so in that sense, it probably makes enough sense. Like, I'm not, I'm certainly not some old timey industrialist that says, to hell with the trees and the flowers. We're going to open up the factories and this, that, and the other. But, obviously, I want to see us move towards a place where the least damaging forms of industry and business that we can do are the ones that we pursue, and we
yeah,
find cleaner ways to power ourselves, and all of that kind of stuff. But um, I just don't think I don't think you throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think much like my view towards political reform, it's a thing that you need to take steps towards rather than
exactly.
deciding tomorrow we're going to stop using oil. I mean, can you imagine the repercussions?
Exactly. The absolute
Yeah.
disaster that would be. And so obviously the last one you have here is racial equality, in which obviously you're in favor of equality. So I see that massive difference there, 66 to 33. So like
Yeah.
what kind of questions were they asking?
I think they were asking me things about whether you believe your race is superior to other races, whether you believe that races ought to be treated equally as other races. Uh, do you think that there are more or less similarities between people of the same country?
Uh-huh.
Questions along those kinds of lines. Funnily enough, actually, even though because there was a breakdown. I don't have a screenshot of it, unfortunately, but there was a breakdown of different labelled ideologies and what my percentage match up with them was on each of the two tests as well. And even though I told you that I got 0% Nazism,
Yeah.
somehow I ended up 43% homo-fascist. And a homo-fascist
What
is
the hell?
apparently a fascist that is also fine with gay people.
Yeah,
so,
that is pretty weird. I'm not sure
yeah,
what they were
yeah.
thinking on that one.
I know. I'd never heard of that class. As far as racialism, I'd say, I mean, probably the most obvious things that I can say. I don't think that you should judge people's character or whether they're worth more or less as a person or whether they're good or bad people on such, on the face of it, cosmetic things as the color of their skin or the country that they happen to be from. I think that obviously as you go through life and you gain experiences of things, it's only natural in the way that your brain processes that there's a tendency that you will have prejudgments or put people in groups of sorts. But I think the reasonable approach to take is treat everyone with a certain degree of respect and give them the time of day until they show you otherwise. Basically, that's that's the general response. But then probably, like I'd said as well, I'm more of the view that, like in the balance between nationalism or internationalism or anything else, I'm more of the view that it's important to look out for, in the sense of the United Kingdom, to look out for the people of the United Kingdom first. But
Mhm.
that's not a comment on race per se, because you have black people in the United Kingdom, you have all kinds of people, but
Yeah, so I can
of the
understand why the
people.
test would have structured its response in that way then.
Yeah, yeah.
No, so I mean, obviously, I have no problem with that either. So I mean, those are some pretty good results. So I mean,
I mean, since it's come out as on the left test a social democrat and on the right test a centre rightist. I mean, I'm going to hazard a guess that centre rightist is probably one of the most left wing answers the right values test can end up
yeah,
giving you,
pretty
I
much. I
imagine.
mean, the center right is becoming almost in this day and age. I mean, after 2016, I mean, the center right is almost extinct at this point, right? Because because of how the Overton window has moved so dramatically. So no, I would see that as a positive outcome if you were testing as a as a supposed right winger and it put you to the furthest left that it could within that category.
Yeah, I'd no doubt probably be one of the wet Tories that's all but been ejected from the party at this point in
Exactly.
time.
They'd probably kick you out and then you'd have to go somewhere else.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, obviously, I mean, I like those results. And I think that obviously people who occupy the position, and of course, I did this for a specific reason. So, I mean, obviously, to my followers, the reason why I decided to go through these results is because I believe that you, Captain Swiss, are like right within that sort of green left kind of center ground. By green, I mean in this case bright green, not dark green. Center
Okay.
ground, where you have basically common sense positions on the need to address climate change. You have common sense positions on the role of the state, the boundaries of where rights begin, and the mandate of the state to organize society ends, etc., etc. These are very center ground positions, and I think for people on the left, we need to be able to engage with people who are in your position without becoming literally crazy in terms of like just nitpicking constantly on people who occupy that center ground position. So I mean, this is going to be like really imperative going forward over the next like 5 to 10 years, for example, because of the fact that there probably are a lot of people who are just to the right of where you are, Captain Swiss, who
Yeah.
might be driven further right if you know if they are if they're treated too badly. Let's put it that way. Like, I don't think it applies to you, obviously. Like, you would obviously hold your position no matter what, because you've sort of well considered why you have that center left position that you're standing on right now. But there are people just to the right of you who are a dead center who haven't made up their mind yet. And so I think it's extremely important that we all work together to make sure that we can convince the center to make the right choice when the time comes.
Yeah, and ultimately, from my view, because like I said towards the beginning of the stream, I was a Labour supporter. Right now, I consider myself unaffiliated. That said, technically, I'm still on their books as a registered supporter, and just for the fun of it, I signed up to the Lib Dems the other week, but that was just a joke. So I'm actually technically a member of two parties right now, but I support neither of them.
Amazing.
But that's but that is for their own internal processes to figure out and kick me out.
Yeah, because one of them is going to have to eject you. It's just a matter of which one it's going to be.
Exactly. I'm signed up to one of them with my real name and the other one as Captain Swiss. So I'm getting emails that say, "Dear Captain, what do you think of this policy or that policy?"
Amazing.
But yeah, but to answer what you had to say, ultimately what I want to see, even though I'm not comfortable entirely with, say, for example, the current Labour Party, or I think the larger direction that the left is in at present, it's not to say that my response to that is to go, oh, well, forget them, I'll go be a right winger. Because that's just simply not where my political instincts are.
Exactly.
It's more the matter of
I wasn't saying that you would do that. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh no, I know exactly what you mean. Yeah, exactly. But the thing is, I suppose I can understand. Well, yeah, I can understand that position, even if it's one that I wouldn't go for myself, because there is a tendency with people a lot of the time to want to have a system of thought to latch onto, to say, okay, this group of people don't have the right answers, therefore is it the group of people on the other side who've got the right answers? Oh, maybe it is. Or maybe because the stewardship of this party wasn't so great for a while and I like the leader of the other party, maybe these are my guys now, or something like that. And there's a tendency for that. I think people like a sense of, I'd like it as well. I'd probably be a lot happier if I could say very clearly to you, I believe in this ism, or I am a this-ist, and these are my views, and this is how society ought to be structured, and I'd have an answer for you on every question. Because at least then I'd have a great degree more certainty in what it was that I believed. But no,
though, I mean, to be charitable on the other side, I'd say that sometimes not having the answer is all right too. And the reason why is because sometimes the answer can only be really discovered through the process. So I will always accept answers from people if they say that that their answer is that they would like to set up a process in which citizens would arrive at the correct answer themselves, because process is very important as well.
Oh, definitely, yeah. I mean, I think one very interesting way of framing just democratic politics as it exists is a dialogue between the different wings of society and the different wings of thought, isn't it? You have those who think the state ought to control more. You have those who think that the markets ought to control more. You have those who want to progress in new social directions. You have those who want to conserve the way that things were previously. And this is a conversation that's had over the course of years and decades and even longer than that. And we have a sort of pendulum that swings, don't we, between a party of roughly left-wing inclinations and a party of roughly right-wing inclinations, and that will vary from time to time. But then you end up, ultimately, it goes left, it goes right, but sometimes things get adopted into it. So some things will get triangulated, so a change that a right-wing party makes may get adapted and adopted by the left, or a change that a left-wing party makes will get adopted by the right. Like, I don't know, like, say, I know that people on the left like to say in the UK, oh, the Tories are going to, dismantle the NHS and sell it off privately and all the rest of it. But if you think in a general sense, the NHS has been around for 60, 70 years now. And for most of that time, the Tories have actually been in power. But it's largely credited as a very sort of socialist-sounding Labour type idea, isn't it? And yet, by and large, they've continued on with it. So I think that there are certain victories that can be won out there for a person's own side in their politics, that if done in the right way and if the public comes with you on it, that's kind of bankable. You know, you can put a pin in it and say, right, that's there for
Exactly.
now. That's going to be much harder to remove later down the line.
Exactly. So, I mean, I think we've had an absolutely great stream, even though it was just the two of us, because usually I don't do streams with just two people in them. Except this one has shown that it can, in fact, be done in instances where I just want to interview one person. So, I mean, obviously, you've been a fantastic guest, and I will always try to invite you back again. So, with that said, thank you to the audience. Thank you for everyone who's been listening. And obviously, thank you for everyone on Twitter who's liked or retweeted the links and so on. And obviously, don't forget to like and subscribe and to, basically continue to support us and see how far we can go. So, thank you for coming on, Captain Swiss.
Not a problem. Thank you very much for having me. I've enjoyed it.
Okay, thank you.